Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from New Mexico Tech on the frontier of science and engineering education. For bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees, New Mexico Tech is the college you've been looking for. 1-800-428-TECH.
I'm Lorene Mills, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's edition of Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Jorge Ramos, who is an author of an extraordinary new book called The Latino Wave. I'll show you in a minute, but is also such an accomplished journalist and newsman. You are the anchor for Univision and have been for 14 years, and the extraordinary recipient of 7 Emmys in journalistic excellence.
Great to be here.
Thank you for coming to our humble station.
Fantastic to be here.
And you're here because you're on a book tour promoting an extraordinary book called The Latino Wave.
How Hispanics will elect the next American president.
Right, and so he's going internationally on a book tour, and we're lucky to have him in Santa Fe and on Report from Santa Fe. Let's talk a little about your background, how you ended up in the position that you have achieved.
I grew up in Mexico City, and I didn't want to be a journalist. I wanted to make news. I didn't want to cover news. And of course, I studied communication, and one day I ended up working in a television station in Mexico, but my third report was censored. Back then, in 1982, it was impossible to criticize the president or the political party in power, the PRI. And I decided that I did not want to be a censored journalist, a frustrated journalist. And I sold my car, and I left for the United States and went to UCLA with a student's visa. But of course, at the end of the third or fourth month, I ran out of money. And I did what any other student would have done. And I started working as a waiter and then as a cashier. And I remember making $15 a day, $5 for the rent and $5 to eat and $5 just to save in case of an emergency. And that's how I started in the United States. I've been an immigrant in this country for 20 years, and I still feel like an immigrant.
Would you define for our viewers what you mean by Latino?
It is very difficult to use one term to define Cuban Americans in Florida, who are, of course, interested in the fall of Fidel Castro, and Mexican Americans and Central Americans in California, Texas, or New Mexico, who might be more interested on immigration and issues or assimilation issues, and Puerto Ricans who want to define the political status of the island and complain that Puerto Ricans in the island cannot vote in a presidential election. How can we accommodate all these groups in just one term? So Richard Nixon in 1970 baptized us as Hispanics. He realized that he did not have enough Latinos in his government, so he ordered the Census Bureau to create this category. Originally, they were going to use the word Latino, but it was too similar to a word in Spanish that is Ladino, which has a negative connotation. So at the end, they decided to use the word Hispanic. Latino, of course, is a reference to the language spoken in the Roman Empire that went all the way to the Iberian Peninsula. And when Christopher Columbus came to America, he, of course, brought Spanish, and Spanish roots are, of course, in Latin. Hispanics is a reference to the Iberian Peninsula, to Hispania. And if you ask the King of Spain which term would he rather use, he would use Hispanic. So what's interesting is that when you ask any Latino or Hispanic to identify himself or herself, first they would say, they'll make a reference to their country of origin. I would say, I'm from Mexico. And then I might say, well, I'm a Latino or Hispanic. Latino maybe if you live on the West Coast, Hispanic if you live on the East Coast. And then later I might say, I'm an American. So we have this double identity. I think it would be unwise and unfair to criticize us for lack of loyalty or lack of patriotism, but we do have this double identity as Latinos, Mexicans, or Americans.
In your book, you make the very interesting point that the Latino culture has not assimilated into the American melting pot the way other cultures did. The Polish, the German, the Irish resisted for a very long time. But tell us how the Latinos, what are the characteristics of Latino culture that they're keeping separate and that they're actually, I think you had this phrase, the Americanization of the Latino, but the Latinification of Americans.
The melting pot ran out of steam. I do not think that Latinos will completely assimilate like Germans and Italians and Poles. Latinos are different because they maintain still today certain characteristics from their countries of origin. First of all, Spanish. Spanish is being spoken in every single corner of the United States. 9 out of 10 Latinos speak Spanish at home. And then we have certain values and certain traditions that we still maintain in this country. There's another element. Italians and Germans, just to give an example, did not stay in touch with their countries of origin. There was a disconnect. And it was very difficult to be an Italian in New York in 1910 and trying to go back to Sicily to visit your family. Nowadays, as a Mexican immigrant or as a Cuban dissident living in the United States, it is much easier to stay in touch with them, not only through Spanish language media, which we get constantly information from Latin America, but also through the internet, through cell phones. In 2 hours, you could be in Mexico or in Central America. And at the same time, we are very proud of our roots and our language. So to be a Latino, sometimes it means that you are able to communicate in Spanish with others just like you. So in that sense, we are different. On the other hand, there's a process of complete assimilation when it comes to the economy and politics. Second-generation Latinos tend to feel more comfortable in English than in Spanish. My son Nicholas, he's 6 years old. He likes to speak more in English than in Spanish. Third-generation Latinos tend to marry outside the Hispanic community. There are millions of Latinos in the process of becoming U.S. citizens, and more than 500,000 Latinos who are attorneys, doctors, who have a PhD or a master's degree. So yes, there's a process of Latinization, but at the same time, Latinos and Latin American immigrants are going through a process of Americanization. It's a process of mutual transformation.
Let's talk some numbers for a minute. What percentage of the United States population is Hispanic or Latino?
At this point, it's about 14%.
14%.
However, we are underrepresented politically because we don't even have one senator or one judge in the Supreme Court. We're lucky enough to have one governor, but there's only been 8 Hispanic governors in the history of the United States. It's not enough. So yes, it's 14% of the population.
One of the things I loved in your book was you said that because of the nature of Latino culture, it is not natural to have only one leader that speaks for the entire population. Tell me who some of the current leaders are and why it isn't working to have only one voice speaking.
It's very difficult to, we're such a diverse community. Any politician or any business would make a huge mistake if they would think that Latinos are a monolithic group. We are not a solid block. So it is almost impossible to have the equivalent of Jesse Jackson for the Hispanic community. We're so different that instead of one Jesse Jackson, we need 20 Jesse Jacksons. And there are many names that constantly are being mentioned as the possibility for one Hispanic leader. Henry Cisneros, the former mayor of San Antonio, used to be one. But is a Mexican-American going to be accepted as the legitimate representatives of Cubans in South Florida who are more interested in the fall of Fidel Castro than on immigration issues? A Cuban who arrives in the United States could become a legal resident 1 year after touching U.S. territory. If a Mexican or a Salvadoran were to do exactly the same thing, he would be deported immediately. So our concerns in many ways are different, and it would be almost impossible to have one national leader. On the other hand, we have many things in common. I think all Latinos, despite of where they come from, can agree on the importance of education and the importance of bilingual education, on immigration issues. The majority of Latinos do agree that there has to be an amnesty for 8 or 9 million undocumented immigrants. And also, we see that U.S. foreign policy does not include Latin America as a priority. At this point, Latin America does not exist for the United States. So even though we are very different, we have many, many things in common.
Well, I remember right before 9/11, Vicente Fox, the president of Mexico, was Bush's best friend, and they were going to work out
You
all
remember
these.
that? Those
I
days?
remember it was the golden day, and then suddenly the entire world
How
changed.
that friendship lasted 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And then after Vicente Fox, then Tony Blair became President Bush's best friend. Something has to change. I do not understand why Latin America is not a priority for the United States. We have to follow the European model. If 15 countries or now 22 countries can create a community of nations, I do not see why the United States, Canada, and the rest of Latin America cannot do exactly the same. Just for practical reasons, immigrants will keep on coming to this country as long as you have a Mexican making $4 a day in their country of origin and making the same amount of money here in 40 minutes. We'll keep on having legal and undocumented immigrants. So I think there has to be an amnesty, but also there has to be an immigration agreement with Mexico and Latin America to have a more orderly flow of immigrants. And at the same time, there has to be a massive investment program in conjunction with trade in order to create more jobs in Latin America and increase salaries so Latinos and Latin Americans do not feel that their only option would be to go north. Something has to be done about it, and nothing has to be done. Latin America at this point does not exist for the United States government.
For this United States
For
government.
this United States government,
Yes.
2004.
Yes. Now, how do you feel NAFTA has been overall? I mean, that was the only expression of outreach was through trade and through commerce. There was no cultural recognition. There was no. So, what are your views on NAFTA?
NAFTA was a very positive step. Without NAFTA, if people are complaining about undocumented immigrants coming here, believe me, without NAFTA, instead of having 350,000 undocumented immigrants coming into this country on a yearly basis, we would have double that or 3 times that. So NAFTA has been a fantastic tool to help the Mexican economy and also, I would say, to the American and Canadian economy. But NAFTA is not enough. There has to be an immigration agreement. If we can trade products and services, why can't we have, I wouldn't say free flow of immigrants, but there has to be an orderly flow of workers who are looking for jobs in the United States, and we can see employers looking for these Mexican workers. There's a double standard here in the United States. I see many people criticizing, especially undocumented immigrants, and saying, you know, they got to go back to their country of origin. Or some people even want to send the army to the border. The reality is that the United States needs immigrants, not only to maintain inflation under control, but also to pay for the social security of a rapidly aging population. And immigrants tend to take the jobs that no American would like to take. Immigrants comprise 23% of farming and fishing, about 21% of all assembly lines, 18% of all service industries. So immigrants are needed in this country.
And New Mexico, you know, I don't think Santa Fe could function without immigrants. And there are groups here, like there's a group called Somos un Pueblo Unido.
I met them this morning, yes.
Yes, who do wonderful, wonderful things to help make the life of the immigrant a lot better.
And now especially for the students, because it's very unfair, for instance, that a Hispanic student who was brought illegally from Mexico by his or her parents, that he or she might be able to finish high school, and then when he goes to college, he cannot go or she cannot go because they cannot pay in-state tuition. They're being considered foreigners, and then they have to pay $20,000 a year as a foreign student. That's impossible, and that has to change.
Well, I think in New Mexico we have reciprocal agreements with Chihuahua and with other Mexican universities where they can pay in-state tuition. And I think we're kind of a more welcoming environment because education is so important. And let's talk about that a little bit. The cultural value of education for the Hispanic community, where does it, would you speak about that?
I've been in a book tour for almost 2 weeks, and in every single city, when I get to talk to Latinos, they tell me that the most important thing for them is education. Actually, poll after poll, and I include those reports in my book, shows that the 3 most important issues for Latinos are education, jobs, and access to healthcare. In other words, the Latino agenda, I mean, it's exactly the same thing as the American agenda. So the problem is that the difference is in the details. Latinos are a younger population, 25 years of age on average. We are growing at a much faster pace, and we have a tragedy within the Hispanic community. 1 in every 3 Hispanic students do not finish high school, and only about 10% of all Hispanic students have a college degree, and that has to change. The first reaction would be by many to say, well, you know, they're lazy or they're not intelligent enough. The reality is that all these students simply cannot continue to college because they have to work. Their families are poor. 40% of Latino families are poor. 60% of Latino families do not have health insurance. So these students feel the need and the pressure from their families to go to work instead of to go to college.
Well, I know that in this state we have a high dropout rate too of just
It's
our
huge.
regular
It's huge,
students,
yeah.
and they've approached it. This governor has done truancy programs and just every way that they can to surround this problem and encourage the kids to stay in. And one of the big incentives is if you stay in school, you are going to earn so much money much more money over your lifetime than if you drop out. So, you know, it's a good carrot to dangle in front of them, but you know, you're right, it is a crisis. It's an absolute
There's a crisis in the Hispanic community, and that's one of the most important things that we care about. So in this election, if President Bush wants to get reelected, or if John Kerry wants to win the White House, candidates have to go beyond saying a few words in Spanish. I met with both of them, and they speak a little Spanish. And they have to go beyond what we call sombrero and taco politics. It is not enough that they bring a mariachi band, arroz con pollo, rice and beans and some margaritas. No, this time they truly have to address the specific concerns of the Hispanic community, and we'll remember. I mean, if they promise an immigration agreement, an amnesty, or to do something for our children, we'll remember. We'll remember the next election.
Well, in the year 2000, Bush made a lot of promises, and then when he trotted out this last amnesty proposal, it went over like a lead balloon. Nobody liked it.
It didn't work.
Yeah.
It didn't work. Even the Hispanic community, there's a lot of resistance because Bush's proposal on January the 7th, he proposed a guest worker program. He's proposing to legalize millions of undocumented immigrants for 3 years, then a renewal for another 3 years, and then he expects immigrants to go back to their country of origin. That isn't going to happen. But this program might have some support in Congress. On the other hand, we have John Kerry. He endorses the legalization of millions of undocumented immigrants who have been working in this country and who have not committed crimes. It's a more permanent solution. The problem is that it does not have support in Congress. So at this point, in this year 2004, we have absolutely nothing for them.
Would you talk a little about the 2000 election and how both candidates, Gore and Bush, courted or didn't court the Hispanic vote?
Bill Clinton used to say that he wanted to be the last U.S. president who didn't speak Spanish. And he was right. George W. Bush is the first U.S. president who speaks Spanish, or should I say the first U.S. president who thinks that he speaks Spanish. To be perfectly neutral in this election, John Kerry is also a master of the 7 words in Spanish, from Viva Puerto Rico to Viva Mexico to Viva Venezuela Libre.
But the funniest one was Ronald Reagan's line when he greeted the president of Mexico when he was governor of California. He said, "Mi casa su queso."
Well,
my house is your cheese.
I mean, there are many, many anecdotes which are fantastic. George W. Bush once in the White House, he had the press corps from Spain, and he was hungry, and he wanted to invite all these Spaniard journalists to have lunch, and he told them, "Tengo mucho hombro," which the translation would be, "I have a lot of shoulders." Hungry journalists always take these clues correctly, and they understood that he meant lunch.
Yeah.
What's interesting, and going back to the 2000 election, is that for the first time in history, we have 2 candidates who tried to speak Spanish. And for the Hispanic community, it's very interesting that they are making an effort to communicate in a language in which many voters feel comfortable. This election, Hispanic voters are much more sophisticated. But in the election of 2000, that paid off for President Bush. I remember talking to him many times, and in one interview, he tried to answer 14 of my 27 questions in Spanish, and that paid off, because even though he made lots of mistakes in Spanish, and who am I to criticize someone who's making mistakes in another language, but even though he made lots of mistakes in Spanish, he did communicate directly, in this case to Cuban American voters. I spoke with President Bush in the year 2001, and I asked him directly, "Do you think that Cuban Americans and the Latin American voters decided the election in the year 2000 in Florida. And he told me, yes, he believed that Cuban American vote decided the election, thanks in part to his effort to communicate in Spanish. And then he added also in Spanish, y no los voy a olvidar. So here we have President Bush believing that the Cuban American community and that Latin vote decided the election of 2000. And maybe this election will be exactly the same. I had the opportunity to talk with John Kerry about a month ago in East LA. He read a whole speech in Spanish. He speaks German and French, and he says he's learning Spanish through tapes. And when I asked him, do you think that Latinos will decide this election? Because Latinos are concentrated in 5 battleground states, Arizona, New Mexico, of course, Nevada, Colorado, maybe Oregon. He told me, yes, he believes that it's entirely possible that Latinos will decide this election again.
Now, that being the subtitle of your book, How Hispanics Will Elect the Next American President, that doesn't fall on some ears as a good thing.
It's a fantastic thing.
Yeah.
For Latinos, it's great.
Yes.
We're underrepresented politically, but right now we can show our true power. No? We're only 8 million Hispanic voters, even though we're 45 million Latinos. 1/3 of our Latinos are under 18 years of age. They cannot vote. Another third are not U.S. citizens. So this election, we can show that we are an important force in American politics.
Now, we've talked about the value of education, but what about the political education? Because a lot of young people, regular American young people, are not even interested in voting. They see the negative ads. They, you know, they go for an alternate candidate, and it's just they don't realize the power that they have in politics.
And that's why it's so interesting that Latinos, young Latinos, they're going to be like 3 or 4 new Hispanic voters in this election, will see that they have a power. It's a misconception that Latinos are not interested in politics. Again, the problem is that many of them are too young, many of them are not U.S. citizens, but here's the scenario. The country is split politically between those who are for President Bush and those who are dislike President Bush. The country is polarized by war. So poll after poll shows that Kerry and Bush are fighting this election neck to neck. 8 million Hispanic voters concentrated in 10 Hispanic states, among them 5 battleground states, among them, of course, New Mexico, will decide this election. The importance of the Hispanic vote is defined by its ability to determine an election, despite the fact that Latinos are not the majority. And for the first time, no candidate will be able to get to the White House without a significant portion of the Hispanic vote.
You dedicate your book. Can you recite the dedication?
Yes, to the first U.S. president, who I'm sure
the first Hispanic
U.S. president, who I'm sure has been born already. I've met thousands of Latinos in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I'm moved that when they go to the bookstores to meet me and greet me, they are bringing their children. And you know, I've met tons of them, dozens of them, telling me this is going to be the first Hispanic U.S. president. They're bringing me the babies, no? Or their 4-year-olds or their 5-year-olds. So it's amazing what just an idea can do. I truly believe that the first Hispanic U.S. president has been born. If you're a Republican, you might think that George P. Bush, the nephew of President Bush, could be the first Hispanic U.S. president. If you're a Democrat, you might believe that Bill Richardson Lopez could become the first Hispanic U.S. president.
Bill Richardson Lopez?
Bill Richardson Lopez, because in Latinos we use 2 last names from your father and from your mother. So Bill Richardson Lopez, of course, governor of New Mexico, everybody knows who he is. His mom was from Mexico. Bill Richardson grew up in Mexico City. Those who do not know Bill Richardson Lopez, he's completely fluent in Spanish.
Oh, yes.
And if Democrats are serious about electing a president, and if they subscribe to the theory that Hispanics will decide this election, they better choose a Hispanic candidate for vice president.
Well, this particular Hispanic candidate, Bill Richardson, has said time and time again that he will stay in New Mexico. He's made amazing changes for our state, moving New Mexico forward, as he said. But the kind of pressures with an offer like that, I can only imagine that if they offer it to him.
If they were to offer him, first, it would be fantastic to win the Hispanic vote. Al Gore only got 67% of the vote in the year 2000. That was not enough. So John Kerry needs 70% of the Hispanic vote to win the election. A Hispanic vice presidential candidate would help that so much that might decide the election. It would be fantastic for New Mexico to have a vice presidential candidate, don't you think?
Oh, we think so. We think so.
I don't know about the Republicans, what do they think about it? But they also should consider major changes in U.S. government. I mean, we need more Latinos in high-ranking positions.
And even Ralph Nader chose Peter Camejo as his running mate.
Which is very important because this third party created a possibility that neither Republicans or Democrats had the guts to do. They selected the first Hispanic vice presidential candidate in the history of the United States. And Democrats should be concerned that maybe some Latinos might want to vote for one of their own in the next election, and that might change everything. Democrats are concerned.
Yes.
They should have done that first.
Well,
They
maybe
didn't.
they will. We have a few weeks to find out.
We'll find out.
I have really enjoyed this interview. I want
Thank you
to
so much.
remind our viewers that the whole book is tantalizing, and it's called The Latino Wave. The
How
subtitle,
Hispanics will elect the next American president.
and it's written by our guest today, Jorge Ramos, and they can see you on Univision.
Every day, 5:30 in New Mexico. Yes.
Oh, good, good. And you have so many years of journalistic integrity and experience.
I have my gray hair to prove it.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank you, Jorge Ramos, for
Thank you.
being with us today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I want to thank you, our viewers, for being with us on Report from Santa Fe.
Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from New Mexico Tech, on the frontier of science and engineering education. For bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees, New Mexico Tech is the college you've been looking for. 1-800-428-TECH.